a photo booth.
Do you know what I'm in? I'm in my self-tape corner.
Fantastic.
Yes,
So
I-
you take
I-
lots of... But you paint?
No, I'm an actress.
Just in case I
Brilliant.
And
But
this
yeah,
is where
excellent.
luckily we had a
I
camera
painted the house.
Well, listen, let's talk a little bit because when I photograph people, one of the main things on the side So here we are. This is really nice to be able to chat to Paul again. We are going to be talking a lot of Cobblers. Since we last had Paul on, he was doing all sorts, and he's done all sorts since, because we've been in regular contact. So I want to know what those all sorts are. So Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, Alistair. Thank you for asking.
Good. How are your all sorts?
Well, I can't actually see them from here, Alistair, but I've been told that, no, I'm joking aside, I've done as you suggested.
Let's start again. Let's not put the innuendo in, all right? So
I can't tell how to sorry, Alistair.
That's all right. So, so how are you doing, Paul?
I'm very well, thank you, Alistair.
So, tell me, how are your all sorts since we've last spoke?
My all sorts have got a bit of direction now, Alistair, because I've started the old Ernest Prattle online vlog on the back of our Talking Cobblers, which I think went very well the first time round, and I've had lots of positive feedback in relation to that. I've took it upon myself to do my own thing.
Yeah, good. And I've really enjoyed them, and I think that they are going to be really special. I mean, the reality is that I never did this before. I never used to do this, and I really enjoy the idea of being able to connect with people, and seeing that we haven't been able to and still can't. It's really can continue on.
It's never been so important, Alistair.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that you've connected with a number of people. I mean, I know that on one of the ones that I did, and you were commenting, that suddenly some of the people who had done time to pause were saying, "Hey, it's Paul," and it was really nice that they recognized you just from your comment. And I know that there's a couple of them that we're going to get onto your vlog now, so we're sharing vloggers.
Sharing vloggers, yes, Alistair.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what I want to do today. I want to talk to you. I want to share some honest opinions, all right? Because you know that we always have talked about posh and common in a very endearing way, all right? You're the posh one, I'm the common one. And is that right? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I mean, you know you're going to get honest opinions from me, Alistair, because that's what Ernest Prattle means.
Oh, tell me about that. What does Ernest Prattle
mean? Well, Ernest is, well, if you look in a dictionary, Ernest is straight talking, and the Prattle part is talking daft, talking silly.
Well, talking cobblers. So
talking cobblers.
Yeah.
So the name came around from Talking Cobblers with Alistair Morrison. So Ernest is my serious part, because you know you've always asked me for giving my opinion, regardless of whether it's a popular opinion or an unpopular opinion. It's my opinion.
Yeah, but also it's your truth as well, and that's what you've given. You've given me as much of your truthful vulnerability as much as your opinion, and that's really important, because a lot of people hide behind that, don't they?
Yes, you were saying about, was it my opinion of our class divide? Posh versus...
Yeah, because you know it's always kind of been that in this country, hasn't it? We always have that kind of north-south divide. I was really interested to know whether you had an opinion, whether you know, when you very young or recently, about what we loosely call posh people, you know, people who potentially you might judge because of the way that we speak or whatever. I mean, what were your opinions when you were younger?
Well, I suppose my opinions were a lot different. I was in my in my teens, in my early 20s. I took a bit of my teenage angst with me and my negative thoughts into my early 20s. And back then, I didn't like posh people. And the reason I didn't like posh people is because I was jealous. And the reason I was jealous was quite simply from my background. And a lot of the elite, as we call them, the upper classes, had privilege. The privilege of going to school, going to a private school funded by their parents, and then given the opportunity to go on to college, university. And then you had my story. My father and his father were notoriously old school. My grandfather came out of school at 14, went down the pit. My father, schooled at 15, went straight down the pit. And his mother and his father would expect him to put bread on the table. There was no options to, you know, go to further education. It was basically pay your way. You come out of school, you go down the pit, or you do whatever the work was at the time. You earn a crust, you pay your way. And that's how it was. Now, my father was the last of that generation. But unfortunately, he had those values instilled in him in how he believed. And so when I left school at 16, for me to go to further education, I mean, my mother would have liked me to go to sixth form or college, but she'd left home when I was around about 13, 14. So I was left with my dad, and basically my dad said, go out, get a job, pay your way, son. So I was academically, I wasn't bad at school. I wasn't the best, but I was in the top sets, and my scores were pretty good. I was academically sound, and I was very good at English. And I personally thought that it would have been nice to go on to college or even university, but I never had the option.
And you know what, Paul, that's really interesting you say that, because just recently, and you know, I wouldn't count myself as being upper class. I'm just kind of in the middle, I suppose. You know, we love to do this, you know, the old John Cleese, Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett sketch.
Yes.
You know, he's the posh one, and I'm just down here. That kind of attitude. And just recently, I was talking to my mother, and she was telling me that with 4 boys, I mean, you know, she had her first child at sort of 19, and by 25, she was traipsing around the world with 4 boys. And my father worked for Cable and Wireless, which is a telecommunications company. But, you know, he had to travel, he had to educate us, he had to find the means to be able to do all of those things. Because it happened to us, we never kind of turned around and said, was that a struggle for them? We kind of just accepted it. And bearing in mind, they had to find airfares from abroad to bring us back to the UK, because traditionally, if you were going to send your kids to an English boarding school, it was, you know, most of the expats always did that, unless the education was really good. So as a youngster, before I was 8 years old, I went to school in Argentina, where we lived. But then traditionally at 8, and my elder brothers had already been sent off, we were bunged in a BOAC plane to go via Rio de Janeiro and the Canary Islands back to Gatwick to go to a school in Sussex. And we were all there for, you know, pretty much 10 years each, with all of those school fees. Now, everyone else goes like, okay, well, wow, that's father must have been rich. And, you know, I suppose in my mind, I think for all the opportunity I was given, my father must have been rich. But just recently, my mother told me that they were scrimping. There were times when they just could not buy stuff, could not buy food, could not buy buy the things that they wanted to, because their sole focus was in trying to get us educated. So
Well, that's great. That's their priority was you.
Absolutely, but actually, in a way, the priority was always you, with your father. But he had his own values, and he had his own means. Now, that's not to say that he wouldn't have wanted you to have gone on to further education. It was just about what he knew. And in a way, that's all my father knew. My father sent us to the school that he went to. It was kind of the tradition. What are we supposed to do in our life with the means that we have? And, you know, sometimes sending a kid to a boarding school is not the right option. You know, very often it's not that good because of the personality of the child. And it's just about making the most of what you can. And actually, in later life, there is always the chance to be able to go back and say, okay, you know, I missed out on that. That's something that I would have really loved to have done.
No, it's in later life. All of my education, all my qualifications have come since I left school.
Yeah.
I've you know done the MVQs and the business qualifications and the management qualifications and English O levels, maths, everything has been funded by myself or via the people I worked for at the time. I volunteered myself to get involved with adult education. I've been an advocate of adult education. I did what I could to kind of fill the gap because.
Yeah, you did, but can you remember at the time what you would have really have loved to have done in further education?
Well, English was one of the things because although at that time in my life, my English may have been a bit stunted due to the fact of I didn't get the education I wanted. I always thought I had a pretty good grasp of the language, and I was always interested in reading and writing, and I always had a love of reading books, and I had quite a vivid imagination. I was very creative. My creativity was obviously teenage years was music, play music, you know. But I think I could have got involved with English in some.
But you have, in a way, Paul, and you know, ultimately, life is an education as well, isn't it? And
Oh, you can say that to your youngster.
yeah, I mean, and ultimately, sometimes what you missed out on forms your character.
Do you know who's Leicester? You know who's genuine working class individuals. We have a choice.
Do you know
And
what? Let's before you carry on with that, talk to me about this whole thing about working class. I mean, nowadays, are we even allowed to say that? The working class.
why aren't we allowed to say working class? Because that's what it is. I mean, you're talking north-south divide, but I'm sure there's a working class across the whole of the UK, regardless of whether you're in the north or the south. There's people that work in the city centre in London who would consider themselves to be working class. It's on the suburb of London you live in.
So is that based on wealth then, do you think, ultimately?
A lot of it's based on wealth, yes. It's a lot of people are in a bubble in the upper classes that I don't think I've ever seen a hard day's work in their life, to be fair. I don't, it's not necessarily north and south. I know what you're saying, that's the old assumptions of north and south. North being working class and deprived, south being middle to upper classes and well off. But I don't know, I've met working class people from all over the UK. And it wasn't...
I think partly, you know, historically, you know, the whole idea of transportation and the canals and the factories on canals and the cotton mills and all of the evolution happened more in the north. And, you know, the whole wealth of this country and the whole history of this country is so steeped around all of those great traditions. And ultimately, that's why the whole community felt so disrupted when those professions became...
Yeah, that's fair. There were traditionally... the north were more, like you said, it was in mining or, you know, whether it be machining or whatever the industry was in that area, you was born into it. That's what your parents did. That's what you did. Now, obviously, that's been breaking down of late due to the fact of the 1980s and Mrs. Thatcher and closing all the mines down and closing the steelworks and shipbuilding yards closing down and the old style industries dying off. There hasn't been industries to replace those things. So a lot of those areas now are deprived of any major, you know, options for the locals, basically. So I suppose you get stuck in a scenario where you're at a loss of what to do, I suppose.
Of course, true of you know, many places, and it's like communities become families because they go into a place of work. You know, used to be lots of factories and lots of places where you would clock in and you would be with your friends and your mates and you'd all know each other and you'd gather together and you know, the pub then became the social area for meeting.
Exactly, which is like the Nottingham area. Originally, historically, it was lace making. More recently, there was the massive Players factory at Lenton, and you know, a good proportion of people of Nottinghamshire would know somebody that worked at Players, manufacturing cigarettes. Now we all know how, you know, it's all gone with regards to tobacco. It's not necessarily something that's you know, wanted in this day and age. So that's now come to an end. I mean, my father, he worked for Players for about 25 years, I think.
Was he a smoker?
Sorry?
Was he a smoker?
He never smoked a cigarette in his life.
I love that. He worked for
Never
Players.
smoked a cigarette in his life. And he said if he ever saw one more cigarette, you know, he'd he said he'd never want to see another cigarette.
Well, I suppose that's the good thing about working for Players, is that he became a non-smoker then.
Yeah.
But in a funny way, you know, you talk about cigarettes being, you know, almost like banned, and there's nowhere to smoke a cigarette anymore. And, you know, I was never a cigarette smoker. My father was. And I remember at the tender age of 8, nicking a packet of his cigarettes, or a couple of them. And I wondered where I was going to have my first cigarette. And I went up the tree house, and it was a really big, tall tree. And right at the top, we've built this, it wasn't even a house, it was like this platform thing. And I went up there to have these cigarettes, and I had both one after the other, felt really sick. And my father had to come up to get me down, smelt the cigarettes. But that was it, you know, I never touched one since. And I often think that you know, one of the things that we should do is kind of, if anyone wants to go into smoking, is just give them 3 or 4, let them get sick on it, then they won't touch it ever again.
Well, yeah, hopefully so. I mean, although I've always had this image of you, Alistair, sat in your smoking jacket with a pipe for some strange reason, with your slippers on. I don't know where that's come from. I don't know.
It's the voice. It's the voice. It's the posh, you see. It's the posh. You're convinced that, you know, I live in a country castle instead of this annex.
Well, I wanted to tell you, Alistair, that a lot of what I just said about the, you know, the upper classes, or the elite, this hatred, it's changed, and I've changed it through education and through getting to know people. And I was lucky enough in my 20s to befriend a young lady called Naomi Smith and her roommate Cameron from Edinburgh. And through visiting them in Edinburgh once a month over a year, 18 months, I got to move in some upper class society circles, and so got to listen to proper music and got to get involved with proper conversations about the arts and music and food, and I see things like, you know, plays and musicals, and I experienced things that I was ignorant about.
But it's interesting, Paul, that you say it's proper things. It's like, you know, proper things are who you are and what comes from you. And so that doesn't mean to say that you know, as DJ Pumpkin, somehow or other your music wasn't proper, or the values that your father instilled in you and his father and him weren't proper. They were absolutely right. And ultimately, it's almost like...
Well, I think proper is the wrong word to use, so it's an alternative, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think it's what you're saying is that it was stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen.
Well, I probably wouldn't have unless I was moved in that direction by somebody.
But that's what education is, and that's what I say. Life's education sometimes gives you more opportunities than necessarily a curriculum education, because you are in the company of people who will have conversations and have opinions, and you will learn from that. But they'll also have their own cultural tastes, and therefore say, Paul, join us to come and watch this play. And you may not have made that choice yourself, but once you're there, you kind of go, oh. But, you know, exactly the same happened to me. I left school. I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. I went to the Bank of England and worked. I really enjoyed it for the lifestyle, but the work wasn't me.
But the credit crunch was your fault, Alistair, was it?
The what?
The credit crunch was your fault.
Completely and utterly my fault. But
you press the wrong button, didn't you, Alistair?
I pressed the wrong button. Do you know what? On a Wednesday evening, I used to work in a cashier's office, and at the Bank of England, the cashiers, basically, we have to tot up the UK's money balance. All the money that comes in and all the money that comes out, we have to then balance that to a nil. Now, if that was a 9 or an 11 pence or something, we'd have to keep going and find the mistake that we'd done, right? So I remember we used to almost the fact that sometimes we'd have to be there till 4 a.m. And they used to have those little suction tube things that you used to put your stuff in and stick it in, and it used to go around the building to someone else. They'd send you some more stuff back to you. And I remember we would always definitively make sure that we were beyond 10 p.m. because they would bring round all the curly sandwiches, probably the leftovers from the lunch canteen or something.
Well, you can't fault it.
And then, you know, we'd have a little break and have a sandwich or two, and then we'd have to get it together.
Did you ever get that bored though, Alice? You think, you know, I'll just take 11 pence out of my own pocket and chuck it in?
Well, do you know what? We always used to work out that if it was 9p or 11p, that it used to be that we would either have put in a 1 or a 10, if you see what I mean. So that, you know, but the reason I say that is because, you know, that 4 years was an education of life for me, not an education of banking. And then I kind of realized that I was never going to enjoy being at the bank forever. And at that point, decided that I wanted to find out about my creative side. So I went to college later to be able to then do photography, film, and television. And
it's all downhill since then.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, that was a good decision, wasn't it?
No, I'm sure it was. Well, it must be, obviously. Or, well, look at it. I'd never been talking to Alice if that hadn't have happened.
Well, do you know what? That's an interesting thing in itself, isn't it? If COVID hadn't happened, would we have ever met Paul?
Potentially not.
Potentially not, and that's a shame, isn't it? That's kind of like when we're on a train and we're 2 hours into the journey and we go through a town and we look to the left and you see all these windows and everyone in the street. And do you ever have that thought in your head? I wonder if I'll ever meet that person.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, funny that, isn't it? It's like that. There's so many little ants in the nest and we'll never get to meet them. And then suddenly, through circumstance, we have the chance to meet someone. But, you know, why do you stick with someone? Why do they become friends?
Well, think about it. I've been locked in the house for near on 9 months, and I've potentially met more new people this year than I ever have before.
Yeah, absolutely. And so have I. And ultimately, that's kind of an important lesson, isn't it? Is that by chatting, we can connect in that way. We then give each other a kind of a truth of who we are, just like you have with me. And because of that, we can engage with so many other people as well.
It's been fantastic. All the stuff we've done together as well. It's kept me going.
Yeah, but and we've never met. So, you know, that's kind of our goal, isn't it? To find them.
You're my best friend I've never met, Alistair.
Well, you're my best friend that I've never met.
Well, thank you. I'll send the money later.
Thank you, darling.
Did you like the Christmas card? You said you liked it.
Yes, thank you very much. That was lovely.
Pleasure, treasure.
Pleasure, treasure.
Yes.
You are full of it today.
I'm full of something, yes, I definitely am.
Bollocks. No, sorry, you're not allowed to say that.
You can't say that, it's terrible.
Cobblers.
Cobblers.
Full of cobblers.
Correct.
Yes, listen, so let's go back a little bit to your 15-year-old, you know, the pumpkin you. Okay, so the last chat we brought on Chantal and we talked about, you know, kind of you and the relationships that you were having. But your family at that stage, so your father, did he expect you to go down the mines?
Well, I wouldn't have expected to go down the masters. It was at that point, and that was in the 80s, where Margaret Thatcher was starting to close the mines down. That's when there was the big strikes in the Nottinghamshire pits, and there was all that trouble with relation to picket line fighting and people being called scabs for going to it. I mean, if my father had left the mine by the time I'd left school, so it was no longer probably a wise idea to go into mining at that time. My dad just wanted him to get a job.
Yeah, but I always like the comment that you make about your dad. You know, whenever you found yourself in situations where, you know, finance is an issue, you've always kind of mentioned your dad's idea that as long as you got £1 more than you had before, you're all right.
That's exactly what he said. He said, you just got to learn the word enough. He says, if you earn £100 a week and your total outgoings comes to £99, life's good. He said, if you earn £100 a week, your total outgoings is £101, then you've got a problem. He says, you've got a roof over your head, and you've got food in the cupboards, you've got eating, and you got your family. What else do you need?
Yeah, do you know what? I think you're absolutely right. I think sometimes nowadays, with all the issues around us, mental health issues sometimes take us beyond that as well, don't they? You know, people do have enough on the table. They do have enough opportunities, but somehow or other they can't necessarily cope with what life brings them. So therefore, there's another brick wall in front of them that they have to climb.
Oh, Alistair, I've only learnt the word enough in the last few years. My finances have been volatile for 30 years, but if I'd have taken my dad's advice from the age of 16 onwards, I'd now have thousands and thousands of pounds in the bank. In fact, I'd be really well off.
Yeah, but apart from the fact that you buy rubbish stuff all the time, like.
Oh, thanks for pointing it out, Lester. Yes, I do. Yes.
Yeah, well, you do. I mean, you know, like.
It's obsessive compulsive disorder, Alistair.
Yeah, I know. I'm pulling your leg, but you know, whenever you tell me that you've bought some sort of electronic calculator or a telescope because you want to look at the stars, and I think. Fair enough. I think that's kind of really, really great to have.
That telescope that Paul's put together for me and then puts it in the window, pointing exactly at the neighbour's bedroom window across the street.
You've got to be careful because.
I know. I say, Paul, don't leave it there, mate. For God's sake. Because what's wrong, Dad? Just point it upwards, not across the street.
Point it to the
Otherwise,
star.
I'll be getting visitors.
So it is fascinating though, because you have talked a lot and been very honest about your finances and the moments where you feel that you have to bring stuff in. If you have it to spend, is your theory, instead of necessarily having it to save.
Put it this way, Alice, right? I came into this world with nothing, and I've still got most of it left.
Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, you know that I've hated cameras all of my life, being a photographer. So I've always had the same cameras. You know, the only time I changed was when I went into working also with digital. But ultimately, it's always the same cameras and everything else. I'm not a hoarder of anything really, other than what you see around me. But you know, it's kind of like I would never get rid of these, my babies, my photographs. And when I sell them, I always feel as if I'm asking people to adopt them instead of necessarily just taking them away from me. I feel sometimes that I want to watch where they place it on their walls and visit my photographs occasionally to say hello.
Alistair, would it be really unprofessional if we just pause for one quick moment?
No, of course. There you are, you're back again.
Do you know what?
What?
I thought I was hearing a strange noise in the back of my head, Alistair. And Alexa in the bedroom decided to start my alarm off. And all I could hear was my Alexa alarm going. So I just shouted at Alexa, told her to shut up.
So Alexa and I are your only company over the last 9 months?
I talked to her quite a lot, as a matter of fact, yes.
And you
She
still
says what I want to hear, mostly.
I'm surprised you still call her Alexa. I thought you'd give her a different name.
I've had a few names for her, but I can't repeat those on the interweb.
Interweb, the interweb. So did we got distracted, didn't we? So we were talking about your father, and I was talking about going to the Bank of England and finding different ways of finding my future. But actually, what we were really getting into was the idea of life's journey and how we learned from that, and how you'd met Cameron and he introduced you to a whole bunch of different things. But, you know, in a way, even Paul Jr. is introducing you to different things because of different technologies. And
oh, yeah.
Do you think Paul Jr. has it easy now?
No. God, no. He's not got it easy. I mean, look at the world at the moment. Look at the world. I mean, his year at school at the moment, or the left behind year, the schooling's been, well, volatile is the understatement, isn't it?
I think the reason that I bring Paul Jr. in, because obviously he's the next generation in your family, and I know that you're very generous to him, and I wondered whether he understood your situation to the extent that he doesn't put the pressure on you, because you would give Paul Jr. everything to the extent that you would be that pound less rather than more. And do you find that Paul Jr. understands that?
He does, to a certain degree. Obviously, he has the pressure of his peers, whereas his friends get things that he hasn't got, or his cousin gets things he hasn't got, and he feels a bit aggrieved that he can't keep up. But his cousin has got two parents. My brother and his other half have both got well-paid jobs between them. There's two incomes coming in that household, whereas his other friends have got parents who have potentially got more money than I have. So I've explained to him that it may be potentially a lot easier for them to buy what they want rather than for me.
Yeah, and I also know that you've told me before that you've had. I think you know, there was a moment where you said, "Alistair, I've got 40 quid in the bank," and
yeah.
And a couple of days later, you told me that Paul Jr. Wanted something which was going to cost 35 quid, and I said that's going to leave you with 5 quid. You know, is that a sensible decision? And maybe Paul Jr. should understand that of you, that yeah, you're you know, you are well-meaning and you wanted to, and you will, but at that particular point, he had to understand a specific circumstance, which I think is a great.
Honestly, he's a good kid, and although he can't help him. I've got a visitor, Alistair.
You have got a visitor. How wonderful.
Yes, I'm here.
That's Magella, I think.
Yes, it's me.
Fantastic. Well, listen,
yeah.
I know that you're probably slightly frustrated at the moment because you normally clean the house before your cleaner comes, don't you?
Well, Magella's not my cleaner. She does everything else. And she looks after my feet for me as well, Alistair.
Oh, really?
She's
Fantastic.
a qualified chiropodist.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Listen, I'm so pleased that that's a very good point that we should leave on, because we're going to get Paul Jr. on anyway, so we can discuss anything with Paul Jr., which I think would be fair, don't you?
The problem is when me and you start talking, actually, we've got so much to talk about, we can never stop.
Do you know what? You're absolutely right. So on that point, while you're going to have your feet done, and I'm
No,
going
that was
to...
last week.
Yeah.
I bring breakfast for him on a Saturday, Alistair. And we
Oh,
sit
oh,
around
brilliant.
and catch up.
Yeah, she did the feet last week, so this week's a week off.
Oh, fantastic. So it's breakfast time. So what have you brought him? Come on, I need...
She's bought me a nice coffee and a croissant.
Listen, that's brilliant. Fantastic.
That's the type of friends you want, Alistair.
That's exactly. Listen, well, enjoy your breakfast, and thank you for chatting, as always. And I think potentially this time we talked a lot of cobblers, but it was quite well-meaning, wasn't it?